Right. Okay. Welcome to this meeting number 15 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health. We're meeting today pursuant to the orders of reference of April 11th, April 20th, 2020. The committee is meeting for the purpose of receiving evidence concerning matters related to the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's meeting is taking place entirely by video conference, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. As at last meeting, the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. In order to facilitate the work of our interpreters and ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Firstly, interpretation in this video conference will work very much like in a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you are ready to speak, you can either click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, or you can hold down the space bar while you are speaking, and when you release the bar, your mic will mute itself, just like a walkie-talkie. A reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be addressed through the chair. Should members need to request the floor outside of their designated time for questions, they should activate their mic and state that they have a point of order. If a member wishes to intervene on a point of order that has been raised by another member, they should use the raise hand function. This will signal to the chair your interest to speak. In order to do so, you should click on participants at the bottom of the screen. When the list pops up, you will see next to your name that you can click raise hand. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. The use of headsets is strongly encouraged. If you have earbuds with a microphone, please hold the microphone near your mouth when you're speaking to boost the sound quality for our interpreters. Should any technical challenges arise, for example, in relation to interpretation, or if you are accidentally disconnected, please advise the chair or clerk immediately, and the technical team will work to resolve them. Please note that we may need to suspend during these times, as we do need to ensure that all members are able to participate fully. Before we get started, for everyone can please check their screen in the top right-hand corner to ensure that they are on gallery view. With this view, you should be able to see all of the participants in a grid-like fashion. It will ensure that all video participants can see one another. During this meeting, we will follow the same rules that usually apply to opening statements and the questioning of witnesses during our regular meetings. Each witness group will have 10 minutes for an opening statement, followed by the usual rounds of questions from members. So I'd like now to welcome our witnesses. So from the Canadian
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Jansen.
Yes, I was wondering, Mr. Chair, with respect, yesterday, my line of questioning was cut off right at 5 minutes, despite the interruption to my time that was caused by the translators being briefly unable to hear me speak. And then I had one more question that would have taken 10 seconds to ask. It wasn't allowed to ask it. So many members of the committee were allowed to ask questions and receive their answer from witnesses after their allotted time was over. Mr. Kellaway's line of questioning for a 6-minute round was extended to close to 9 minutes. So in the interest of fairness, I would like the committee, if the committee be assured that first, any interruption of questioning due to technical issues would be added to the end of the members' allotted time for questions and answers. And second, that there would be consistency about how those extensions will be granted to all members, regardless of party or what they're asking or subject to the same standard.
Thank you, Ms. Jansen. I assure you that I did give you far more than your allotted 5 minutes. The rule I try to follow is if you are speaking at the time when your time runs out, to let you finish speaking, and then allow the witnesses to respond. Sometimes witnesses take quite a long time to respond, and that's why the time takes quite considerable time.
So, Mr. Chair, I think virtual meetings are really a challenge because of the fact that they do get interrupted. You actually did interrupt me during my my questioning, so that took some time away. So I'm just looking for consistency. I mean, if we do have to stop for these kinds of things, it would be great to consistently add that to the end of the questioner's time. You did give me exactly 5 minutes, but that would include the interruption that in regards to the mic.
Well, thank you, Ms. Jansen. You'll certainly, I'm certainly trying to be fair with everyone as we go forward. I did advise you that your mic was up and no one could hear you.
Right.
I don't think that took more than about 5 seconds, and I gave you more than that much time in recognition, therefore.
So I'm just looking then that we could have that kind of consistency, because apparently some people were given, like I say, 9 minutes. And then when there's interruptions, some people are given more time and others are not. So just looking for consistency with a virtual meeting like this, these are the challenges that we face.
Yes, indeed, they are the challenges, but we are proceeding with questioning and with timing the same way as we would do in a regular meeting. I do try to make allowances for technical issues of that kind. I give people extra time if they've, if the witnesses couldn't hear, for example, or the witnesses they asked could not respond, for example. In any case, as always, I will try to be scrupulously fair to everyone. So carrying on, I'd like now to welcome the witnesses. For the Canadian Police Association, we have Tom Stamatakis, the president. For the Union of the Canadian Correctional Officers, we have Jeff Wilkins, national president, and Eric Thibault, national vice president. For the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Patrick Tanguy, assistant deputy minister for emergency management and programs. And for the Public Health Agency of Canada, we have Sally Thornton, Vice President, Health Security Infrastructure Branch, and Cindy Evans, Acting Vice President, Emergency Management. So we will start with the Canadian Police Association and Mr. Stamatakis. Mr. Stamatakis, you have 10 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you this afternoon as you continue your study into the Canadian response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the opportunity to provide a frontline policing perspective into this important ongoing issue. Before I begin, however, I just want to take a brief moment first to offer my most sincere condolences to the family of Constable Heidi Stevenson of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and all the victims of the horrific attack that took place in Nova Scotia this past weekend. I'd also like to offer my thanks to Prime Minister Trudeau, Minister Blair, and all elected officials from all parties who have offered your kind words of support to our policing colleagues, both in the RCMP and from other municipal services that have come together to help us in this important ongoing investigation. I particularly appreciate having the opportunity to appear virtually this week, as this was originally scheduled to be the week of our Canadian Police Association annual legislative conference, which gives our members a chance to come to Ottawa and meet with their federal elected officials. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed our plans, and while we've already started planning for a 2021 conference, appearing before you gives me the chance to introduce our organization to the new members of the committee, as well as reintroduce myself to some familiar faces. The Canadian Police Association is the largest policing advocacy organization in the country with over 55,000 civilian and sworn members who serve in police agencies from coast to coast to coast. Our members have been on the front line of this pandemic from day one, working in close partnership with other first responders. And while there has been a bit of a learning curve for all of us as we adapt to these new circumstances, I hope that this committee and your eventual report will help provide a framework to identify areas across multiple sectors that worked and where we need to improve in the future. This pandemic again highlights the difficult circumstances the members I represent typically face while attempting to perform their duties and keep the public safe. We often have no idea who we're interacting with in the community and have little control over the environment where those interactions take place. Since the beginning of March, police officers continue to perform their duties despite public health orders directing most citizens to stay at home and physically distance. It's important to acknowledge this and the aggravating effect this pandemic has had on a profession that is already struggling with mental health and wellness challenges and the impact on individual police personnel and their families. I'd now like to take a few minutes to briefly outline some of our key issues from a policing perspective, and then hopefully leave as much time as possible for questions. First and foremost, one of the main challenges that our members have faced is with respect to a general lack of consistency around messages from various levels of government, as well as health officials regarding the parameters of general stay-at-home orders, which has led to some confusion and potentially uneven levels of enforcement across the country, which has been frustrating to the public as well as those tasked with enforcement. I believe it's important to emphasize that while there have been certainly some well-documented cases of potentially overzealous enforcement of quarantine orders, statistics that have now been released so far show that both the police and bylaw enforcement agencies have been successfully using education and encouragement in the overwhelming number of cases. That being said, I can certainly understand the frustration and even anger that has been expressed by members of the public who have found themselves potentially facing significant fines for infractions that can, in many cases, seem unclear. While I understand that this particular issue involves a number of different provincial as well as municipal orders, I believe there should be a role for the federal government to play in these circumstances, especially with respect to ensuring as much as possible consistent and clear messaging with respect to public health orders. Police understand that we have an enforcement role, but messaging regarding our role needs to be clear and consistent from the outset to avoid undermining police legitimacy and public confidence. Another area where I believe the federal government could play an important role is around the utilization, supply, and access to personal protective equipment, or PPE, for first responders across the country. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a patchwork of policies announced by police services regarding when PPE is to be worn by personnel, and even more variation with respect to overall access, particularly for small and medium-sized police services and those policing in rural or remote parts of our country. Again, there's a significant challenge involved, given that outside of the RCMP, procurement for policing is usually a provincial or municipal issue. I believe these circumstances have highlighted the need for additional coordination where possible from the federal government to ensure at least some minimum standards are achieved. Further, from an occupational health and safety standpoint, as associations, we have noticed a lack of consistency around managing exposure for frontline personnel, with a view towards protecting both police officers who are at heightened risk of exposure as well as their families. Ideally, as a national organization, we believe it would be beneficial for those who are tasked with frontline responsibilities to know that if they are exposed to COVID-19, that measures exist to ensure they have access to decontamination facilities, that they are tested as quickly as possible, and if positive, that steps have been taken in advance to make sure they can minimize the chance of further infection to their families and loved ones, including alternate physical accommodation arrangements if necessary. These steps should include establishing a presumption that a positive test is work-related to remove any uncertainty or anxiety regarding treatment or income disruption. One final area of concern I'd like to highlight with respect to the pandemic response is with respect to Canada's correctional facilities. I know there have been calls to expedite the release of certain offenders from the prison system, given concerns regarding COVID-19 and the potential for outbreak within these facilities. Obviously, while protecting the health of inmates in these facilities must be a key concern for the government and the agencies responsible for maintaining our correctional infrastructure and the health of their personnel, our association has significant concerns about the potential consequences of releasing these offenders, particularly given the current circumstances across Canada. The response to COVID-19 has already placed a significant strain on law enforcement agencies across Canada, and given the current projections around transmission, I believe it's safe to assume that strain will only be aggravated as more frontline personnel are exposed to the virus and are subject to self-isolation measures. The release of a significant cohort of offenders from correctional facilities at a time where our resources are already stretched thin has the potential to add unnecessary stress to an already overburdened system, particularly given that many of the services offenders rely on for monitoring, rehabilitation, and reintegration are themselves facing mandatory shutdowns. To conclude, I would suggest that overall, despite these concerns, I believe the policing response to these pandemic circumstances has been positive. Our members, like all Canadians, recognize the uncertainty that this almost unprecedented situation has forced And despite that, our members will continue to display the professionalism and dedication that our communities expect and deserve. I look forward to your questions, and once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before your committee today. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers. Mr. Wilkins, I believe. Go ahead, 10 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and witnesses on the panel. I'm joined by Eric Thibault, who's the National Vice President for the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, and we both would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'd like to begin by expressing condolences on behalf of UCOSAC CSN to all members of the RCMP family for the tragic loss of Heidi Stevenson, and would also like to recognize that we send our condolences to all of our members, as well as we have lost two correctional managers, one from Spring Hill and one from Nova Institution. It's absolutely tragic times here in Nova Scotia. That's where I'm talking to you today, and we'd like to send our condolences. I'd like to begin by expressing my pride in representing such an incredible group of professionals who continue to fulfill their mandate in the face of this invisible threat, COVID-19. Our members, who on a daily basis enter one of the most dangerous workplaces in Canada, bravely continue this work, and with an additional personal risk, and for that they must be commended. The Union of Canadian Correctional Officers, UCOSAC CSN, and the correctional officers which we represent have only ever asked one thing from this government outside of our negotiations, and that's to have the protections in place to make sure that all the dangers to our health and safety are mitigated to every extent possible. With this threat, UCOSAC CSN has called for added protection in the form of personal protective equipment, of course, virus testing for all frontline workers, involvement in the contingency planning process at the local level and regional and national levels. Contemplating and preparing for what-if scenarios are essentially a part of a correctional officer's DNA. Unfortunately, this virus has created many of these scenarios, and many questions remain unanswered for the vast majority of our membership. In regard to personal protective equipment, over one short month, there has been a significant shift in culture for mask wearing in our institutions. The beginning of this crisis saw our members threatened with discipline for donning PPE in the form of masks if they did so under their own assessment of risk. However, there were also work refusals on this issue. The Correctional Service Canada's position was that only they could assess the risk, and they were worried that wearing a mask could elicit fear amongst the inmate population. And now the opposite is true. In just one short month, discipline is now being threatened if a mask is not worn routinely, if physical distancing is not an option. This example may be dramatic, however, it illustrates a complete culture shift over a very short period of time, resulting from a continued push from the union to do everything possible to mitigate risk. And I simply don't understand is that how this was not something that was communicated during all of the contingency planning processes. Our conversations around COVID-19 began with the Correctional Service on February the 6th during our regular National Labour Management meeting. On this date, it was communicated to us by the Public Health Agency of Canada that the risk was determined low for the coronavirus. And looking back at that particular meeting, I don't believe either side of the table would have predicted how our lives would change within one short month. On March the 9th, an initial conversation took place with senior management over some steps that the CSC were taking to prepare for the virus as the threat to Canadians was increasing. These initial steps included screening visitors that may have traveled or otherwise show symptoms, local contingency planning, inventory for PPE and procurement. And just 2 days later, the Prime Minister announced budgetary measures for a response to COVID-19, and we began to see restrictions put in some provinces as states of emergency were declared. The week of March the 16th, UCOSAC CSN quickly adapted to what is our current reality, and the reality we're seeing today. We set up regular teleconferences, video conferences to keep the communication open with both the CSC and the National Joint Council. Since that day, ongoing and regular discussions about all issues have taken place, as well as countless bilateral telephone calls to solve issues that seem to crop up daily. In my history as a union leader, I would characterize the past month as unprecedented with respect to the consultation and joint efforts to tackle a common issue, and that's COVID-19. It was on March the 26th that we learned of our first confirmed case of COVID-19. One of our members working at Port Cartier Institution contracted the virus through community transmission sometime between March the 9th and March the 14th, and it inadvertently spread the virus while asymptomatic. It was over the next days that we learned firsthand how incredibly viral COVID-19 is, as the number of positive cases grew with only a few days. During this time, there was a significant amount of work done by all parties to reduce further spread. Contingency measures were both developed and put in place. The institution, however, did experience a dramatic staffing issue within hours, as many correctional officers were directed to quarantine as a result of public health advice during the contact tracing investigations. On April the 2nd, I sent a letter to the Public Safety Minister, Bill Blair, regarding an urgent need to have testing available for correctional officers. Though the advice from public health is sound advice to mitigate spread, sending a significant portion of the front line home to self-isolate has a direct negative impact for all those staff who remain. Since the Federal Emergencies Act has not been declared in force, all parameters around testing for COVID-19 remain under provincial jurisdiction, and this has resulted in different responses for our members' eligibility to receive the testing across the country. Affected sites have been forced to find creative solutions through scheduling and voluntary workplace change to simply hold the front line. With a broader scope for testing, members who may be asymptomatic could in fact be tested and if determined negative for the virus, report back to work much sooner than a 14-day quarantine. This remains a significant issue, and we're seeing that as we see the virus continue to infiltrate our institutions. Currently, we have 4 sites experiencing significant staffing difficulties. These sites are the Centre Fédéral de Formation, Joliette Institution, and Port Cartier Institution in Quebec, as well as Mission Institution in British Columbia. Of these institutions, they would greatly benefit from quick and ongoing testing for both inmates and staff. UCOSAC-CSN has continually called on the government and our employer to make testing available for staff, as it's simply not a reality that we can stay home. There must be an exception for federal employees critical to the public service without the need for the federal government to invoke the Emergencies Act. As we're all aware, the spread of this virus happens when people don't have the ability to distance themselves from one another. Self-isolation has proven to be an issue in some of our facilities. Single occupancy cells, which are equipped with a toilet and running water, allow inmates to easily self-isolate. However, there are many institutions that are designed with a communal living space approach, and they lack proper isolation, cells for isolation. The latter design units are great for rehabilitation, for a sense of community, but they are a detriment in a crisis that we face today. Infrastructure or a lack thereof directly impacts a local plan of attack if the virus enters the facility. There are other challenges as well. Some institutions are in very remote locations. The ability to draw staff from one institution to work in another becomes increasingly difficult when they are secluded, institutions such as Port Cartier or Grand Cache. These are challenges that become unique, and they must be thought about when building contingencies. It's commendable that our government has essentially handed the reins of this crisis to the scientists and the public health officials. And in a crisis such as this, it becomes very clear that the government's role has seemed to shift from a legislative body to a support mechanism for decisions made by Canada's health professionals and scientists. In any crisis, trust should always be put in the hands of the professionals. That said, while we have found that CSE has generally heeded the advice of public health, they have also at times ignored that advice due to staffing issues or those around potential overtime costs. We have had members told to return to work after exposure and testing, but before the results were back, and that places staff and other inmates at risk. Again, had consultations and contingencies been thoroughly examined at the onset of this virus, we would likely not be in that position today. Had CSE listened to their frontline staff, had the government heard our plea for easier testing, we may not be in the dire situation we find ourselves today in some institutions in this country. In conclusion, it's important to say that the world was not ready for this pandemic. Hindsight is always perfect. However, had proper steps been taken when the seriousness of this virus started to be widely known, many of our institutions would have been much more prepared. The deadly virus requires a proactive and strong response, and a response that is reactive and slow to adjust only places staff, inmates, and the general public at further risk. I thank you, and again, I will welcome any questions that the committee has.
Thank you. We go now to the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Monsieur Tanguay, c'est à vous. 10 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to appear before the Standing Committee on Health. And let me begin by thanking you for this opportunity. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share information on the role of public safety that Public Safety Canada plays in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Patrick Tanguy, Senior ADM, Emergency Management and Programs Branch, Public Safety Canada. Now, as we all know, much has changed since I last appeared before this committee on February 3rd. The international and domestic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have affected all aspects of our lives and all sectors of society in communities large and small across the country. These impacts have been especially felt by the public safety sector, including workers and volunteers involved in emergency response and those who work to maintain the safety of our communities as COVID-19 unfolds. Now, before beginning, I'd like to recognize the hard work of our first responders and public safety officers and volunteers in supporting Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, while their own personal and professional lives have been impacted. This includes the organizations that are represented at today's meetings, but also many others too numerous to list. I'd like to start by reminding the committee of Public Safety Canada's role in emergency management. As set out in the Emergency Management Act, my department plays a key role in coordinating emergency management activities among federal government institutions and other entities and territories. The Government Operations Centre, which is a whole-of-government asset housed in my department, is the main platform that we use for accomplishing these activities. As outlined in the Federal Emergency Response Plan, the Government Operations Centre supports response capacity and coordination during events of national interest, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The Government Ops Centre brings all partners together in response to a common environment to harmonize collective actions and abilities into efficient analysis and action. The Government Ops Centre also interacts on a daily basis with the provincial and territorial emergency operations centres and coordinates official requests for assistance that would come from federal departments, agencies, provinces, and territories. In addition to the role of the Government Operations Centre, Public Safety's Communications Directorate provides leadership in the whole of government communications on the event by coordinating with other federal departments to develop key messaging for the Government of Canada to ensure calm and instill confidence in Canadians. I'd like to re-emphasize that my department exercises its leadership in emergency management in close cooperation with provincial and territorial counterparts. This is accomplished through the various federal, provincial, territorial tables at the ministerial, deputy ministerial, and assistant deputy ministerial levels. This includes FTP ministers responsible for emergency management and senior officials responsible for emergency management. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, these tables have been meeting multiple times a week to remain apprised of current priorities, potential gaps, and any requests for assistance we may receive. Over the last couple of weeks, my department has engaged these tables on such management issues as emergency management, capacity in the north, remote and isolated communities, essential services, and priorities for PPE for the non-health sectors. Now, under the Emergency Management Act, my department is also responsible for leading the overall national effort to strengthen the resilience of critical infrastructure. We do this in close cooperation with lead federal departments responsible for each of Canada's 10 critical infrastructure sectors and with the private sector. The National Cross-Sector Forum is the primary mechanism for government to engage national leaders from each of Canada's 10 critical infrastructure sectors on the COVID-19 response. The National Cross-Sector Forum has been meeting weekly to provide critical infrastructure leaders with updates on health, provided by PHAC, and on the Government of Canada's planning efforts. As you know, the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic are wide-ranging and affect public health, federal organizations, and their partners. Given the number of actors and issues involved, coordination is key for ensuring a coherent whole-of-government response. We've taken a number of steps to bolster the Government Ops Centre's capacity to coordinate the collective federal response to this emergency. To promote greater collaboration and information sharing among the various implicated parties, we have embedded subject matter experts from a number of lead federal departments into the Government Operations Centre. Now, this includes Indigenous Services Canada, Health Canada, and the Canadian Armed Forces. We've also embedded representatives from the Canadian Red Cross to support greater information sharing with civil society organizations, recognizing that they play an important role. We also acknowledge that many of them are assisting, and using this enhanced capacity, we have created a dedicated situational awareness team within the Government Operations Centre. It's led by the Canadian Armed Forces and it produces a daily situation awareness products to inform our response. In addition to supporting enhanced security situational awareness, the Government Ops Centre is also using its bolstered capacity to support integrated federal planning. The Government Ops Centre has been working with a number of federal partners to develop the response plan for COVID-19. The objective of the plan is to identify overarching roles and responsibilities and key activities of each federal department to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. It identifies a number of cross-cutting issues such as critical infrastructure, public health measures, business continuity planning, and others. The provinces, territories, and the private sector, as well as the Canadian Red Cross, have been engaged in the development of this plan. As I mentioned, critical infrastructure protection is a key part of my department's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My department is working to help our external partners, the provinces, territories, municipalities, support the resilience of critical infrastructure systems. Our focus here is protecting the assets, systems, networks, and essential services to the health, safety, security, and economic well-being of Canadians. A failure of any of these systems can have cascading effects on other sectors, which can amplify these economic, social, and safety impact on Canadians. As you know, a number of jurisdictions within Canada have announced that business closures and border measures are in effect. Provincial and territorial announcements have highlighted that only organizations necessary to provide essential services are permitted to operate. Earlier, that my department released a document called Guidance on Essential Services and Functions in Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic. That was to provide clear advice when it comes to determining services and functions that are essential. I'd like to conclude by highlighting some of the areas we'll be focusing on in our emergency collaboration moving forward. First and foremost, we'll continue to work closely with our emergency management and critical infrastructure partners the response to COVID-19 is a concern. We need to be able to respond in the event of flooding, for example, wildfires. Resources and personnel required for a response may already be deployed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to work closely with our partners, therefore, to manage these challenges. We'll also need to work with our partners to support the long-term mental well-being of those involved in the frontline response, including public safety personnel. Finally, thank you for the opportunity to make some initial remarks. I will be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Ms. Jansen, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. I'm really struggling. The volume, you had said put your hand up. The volume between the English and the French was equal for me. So I was impossible to understand. And my apologies. I understand now. I've been texting my colleagues. They say that you can mute the original, which I tried, and that wasn't helping either somehow. So I don't know. It was a challenge. I thought if I raised my hands, it would get your attention and we could have fixed the volume issue. Thank you.
I actually had the same problem. I had did a text with the clerk, and they're sorting it out behind the scenes. What had been suggested at the beginning was that if that happens, if you toggle the interpretation, it might adjust properly. I tried that; it didn't work. Hopefully, they are working on that behind the scenes. Also, you're able to do a point of order. So the instructions at the beginning are that if you have a point of order, raise it. Unmute your mic, raise your point of order, and then if you want to intervene on someone else's point of order, to raise your hand. The hand signal is a little bit subtle for me, so it's way off on the side. So we'll figure out how this works as we go forward. Anyway, thank you, and hopefully that problem is being addressed and will be resolved soon. We go now to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Ms. Thornton, I believe you have a statement to make. 10 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear today before the committee. I too would just like to take a moment to express our condolences for lost colleagues. Our thoughts are with you. As you know, our top priority at Public is the health and safety of Canadians. The Public Health Agency of Canada is actively monitoring and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and planning for possible scenarios based on the evidence and as the science continues to emerge. Since the outset, FAC, with our provincial and territorial public health authorities across the country, have been working together to ensure that our preparedness and response measures are appropriate and adaptable based on the latest science and evolving situation. Within the agency, FAC has activated its Health Portfolio Operations Centre to ensure effective planning and coordination of response efforts in collaboration with international, federal, provincial, and territorial partners. You have heard from many people from the Public Health Agency since the outset. Today, myself, but also my colleague Cindy Evans, who's the Acting Vice President of Emergency Management, we're on a different side of the organization. And I understand that today you've invited us here specifically to provide an overview of Canada's National Emergency Strategic Stockpile, our inventory management, and disposal of medical masks and gloves. So I would like to talk about the NES, as we call it, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. But first, setting the situation. As you know, public health is a shared responsibility among federal, provincial, territorial, and local governments. There's a fundamental assumption, underpinning any emergency management, and that is that the provinces, the territories, and local governments are prepared to a reasonable extent for the most common emergencies. So the NES, as we call it, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile, is the federal government's health emergency stockpile. Our role in this stockpile is twofold. One, it's to provide surge capacity to provinces and territories at their request when their own resources are not sufficient. And two, it's the sole provider of certain assets required for rare public health emergencies, for example, costly or rarely used vaccines or antidotes. To understand the NES as it is today, it is actually helpful to understand its history and how it's evolved. It was actually created in 1952 during the early world years of the Cold War. At the time, the biggest threat to national health and safety was the threat of nuclear attack. The NES was authorized to stockpile essential health supplies for civil defense purposes. During the 60s, the inventory expanded to include bed hospitals, treatment centers, basic laboratories, and blood donation units. Many of these were pre-positioned across Canada in schools, church basements, community centers, and other locations. In the 1980s and 90s, the scope of the NES expanded to include the capacity to respond to natural disasters and other emergencies by stockpiling supplies needed to support evacuations and care for displaced individuals. So things like kits, setting up reception centers, mobile kitchens, airport disaster units. The turn of the century marked a dramatic change in the nature of the international security and public health threats, marked by the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, the 2003 SARS outbreak, and the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. During this period, the NES evolved to focus more on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. It began to move away from beds and blankets and increased its holdings of antiviral medications, a key treatment in response to viral outbreaks such as influenza. The role of the NES in terms of procurement also evolved as a potential collaborative sourcing organization and a clearinghouse, paving the way for possible bulk procurement. There's been ongoing changes and modernization to the NES, based in as an important part of an emergency management and preparedness response. In 2012, the NES contained both valuable medical and pandemic response supplies, but it also had outdated field hospitals and supplies that were no longer viable. Assets were held in various locations across 9 cities and in approximately 1,000 pre-positioned sites in the provinces and territories, including within schools and community centers. Many of the sites have been moved or closed. Some of the assets were no longer in good quality due to the storage. An independent assessment of the Federal Warehouse Network looked at the footprint and found it was too large. Recommendation was to move from 9 warehouse locations to 6, and that would be more efficient and provide the same response capacity. We began to implement that. As a part of that, items of value were repositioned and other obsolete assets were disposed in accordance with Treasury Board Directive on disposal of surplus material. In terms of inventory management, the NES reviews its stock of equipment regularly, and as part of the review, expired material is disposed. So in response to your specific question, for example, in 2019, approximately 2 million expired masks and 440,000 expired gloves were disposed of during the closure of one of the warehouses in Regina. The masks and gloves had been purchased in 2009. They passed the limit of 5 years for their use as recommended by the manufacturer. The Public Health Agency follows strict guidelines when deploying materials. If the agency cannot account for the quality of the material, it will not deploy it. Even under these current circumstances, where guidance allows for use of some expired personal protective equipment, we examine very closely any equipment that is sent over and that's 5 years old or more. This is in accordance with manufacturers' guidelines. When disposing of surplus assets, we offer them to partners, we sell them through GC Surplus, and we recycle where we can. As a last resort, sometimes we do need to dispose of obsolete, expired, or unusable assets. It is important to note that when we have stockpiles that are about to expire, we do consider whether or not they can be donated for suitable use. But there are parameters around donations. For example, the World Health Organization, they will accept donated PPEs, but the equipment must still be good 2 years before its expiry date. So that would mean that we would have something on stock for 3 years, have to donate it and rotate. When it comes to replenishing our assets, we do it based on risks and threat assessments and credible scenarios that outline the types of risks that we face and may need to respond to. Our decisions to purchase assets focus on low probability but high impact events where it makes the most sense for the federal government to be the sole provider. And it's with a planned very nominal budget of about $2 million a year. So in summary, the NES complements provincial, territorial, and local capacity. We prepare for low probability, high impact events, for example, terrorist attack or a major natural disaster. We arrange for the continued availability of pharmaceuticals, equipment, and medical supplies that are rare but difficult to obtain in a short time frame. We also fill a niche role in terms of stockpiling certain high-value items. Think of a smallpox vaccine. It really is intended as a surge capacity, and it maintains its ability to facilitate bulk procurement with provinces and territories. In order to respond to the unprecedented challenges of this pandemic, the NES has been mobilized to support response efforts. We are leveraging bulk procurement capacity, working with provinces, territories, Public Services Procurement Canada, and Health Canada to procure supplies for frontline healthcare workers. We've worked closely with the provinces and territories, Public Services and Procurement, and Health Canada to make these bulk purchases and to allocate donations. We've ramped up our internal capacity with dedicated units for the procurement of PPE, identifying appropriate PPE for health service providers, preparing requisitions, reviewing product specifications, and testing products. We've also deployed NES equipment and supplies in response to requests for assistance from provinces and territories. We have engaged the Canadian Armed Forces to facilitate logistics. This is making a huge difference. We went from about 15 to 30 deployments a year to 15 to 30 deployments within a month. The volume is much bigger than anything we've been prepared for. This Canadian Armed Forces, they're working around the clock. We've got over 2 dozen here. They provide air and ground logistics and support for the global movement of these goods. We also entered into an agreement with Amazon Canada, who leverages Canada Post and Perlator to facilitate the distribution of PPE and supplies purchased by the government. Since April 1st, we've shipped approximately 1.2 million N95 respirator masks, 6 million surgical masks, and 8 million nitrile gloves to provinces and territories, and more are expected to arrive and be distributed in the coming days. So the NES has a long history. It's got moved from a wartime stockpile to a more modern inventory of niche assets for low probability, high impact events. This pandemic has really been an opportunity for us to mobilize the bulk procurement, large-scale shipping, product verification, and testing. And we've been mobilized in an unprecedented fashion. Responding to the events necessitated new and innovative partnerships, non-traditional approaches, all of which will inform the future of the NES. So, Mr. Chair, we thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to provide an overview of the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile, and we'd be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We will go now to start our questioning rounds. As usual, we have an agreement to try to do 3 rounds of questions. We start with the first round. Monsieur Paulus, c'est à vous, 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much. Before I start, I want to make sure that the translation works.
C'est bon? Merci.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I have questions for Mr. Tanguy at Public Safety. Since the beginning of the pandemic, since we've known that this virus could get to Canada, we've always questioned the role of Health Canada and the role of Public Safety Canada. Since the beginning, I've been participating to the health committee meetings, and I've asked questions regarding the border because at the end of January, there were no cases of coronavirus in Canada, and the first line of defense was the border. At that time, we've been told that we were following the public safety's directive. You've talked to us about a protocol. Everyone has good protocol in theory, but in practice, we need to act when things happen. So I would like to know what you think about the situation since the beginning. From the point of view of public safety, there was a lack of coordination. And the directives of Health Canada, did they have an impact on your operations? Answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I will tell you 3 things.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me? I will raise my volume. Now, can you hear me? Says Mr. Tanguy.
I can hear you. This is
D'accord. Bon.
OK.
Good. I had lowered the original so that I didn't hear both. That's why I didn't hear you, but now I can hear you. Okay, thank you. So 3 important things. First of all, the GOC was activated on January 23rd. This was a progressive activation. We passed from level 1 to level 3. We reached level 3 on February 2nd. My second point, the coordination among different departments was already happening when it was activated, that GOC. So we worked with the Public Health Agency of Canada and Health Canada. And then my third point, it was very important to coordinate our response, and we had to base everything on science. This is why continued interactions with our Health Canada colleagues and our Public Health Agency's colleagues allowed us to bring together all departments, and we respected the directives of Health Canada. But were the directives efficient? There were no directives in airport, and the president of the CBAC said twice at the Health Committee that his hands were tied because he had to follow Health Canada's directives. But he would have taken different measures to ensure safety at the border because we found out that the virus entered Canada with travelers. So the protocol that was in place, it was sufficient in your opinion? Answer. The protocol was very important for most public servant. Well, it's important to look at science to know what to do. I have another question. Today, a question was asked to the Prime Minister and the Vice Prime Minister regarding the border. There is an issue with the United States. We have a joint agreement with the United States that was renewed for 30 days. But yesterday, CBSA's agents were told that now people who want to seek asylum can do so at an official point of entry. So people who would have gone to Roxham will go to Lacal right now. So we have a lot of questions regarding that. The border is supposed to be closed. So why do we accept asylum seekers? Thank you for your question. I am not in a good position to give you comments on that. However, I could ask your question to CBSA's agents, and they will be able to give you details regarding this. How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, good. Parfait.
Very good. Mr. Stamatakis, you said that there were coordination problems, lack of equipment in correctional institutions. So since the beginning, we've seen that everyone seems to say that work was well done, that plans were activated at the right time, but you said that there was a lack of coordination. So my question, what should be done quickly, and what would be your suggestions for the future? Are there protocols that should be changed in the future?
I think that there needs to be better coordination around the messaging. We were hearing federal officials commenting about things like self-isolation orders or quarantine orders publicly, and those comments were widely covered by the media. Yet on the street, on the front line where our members are operating, we were not getting any information initially about what the expectations were of police. So that puts the police then in a difficult situation, because we're now in the middle of, the public who are saying, what are you doing about this? And why aren't you taking enforcement action? And then in between those people with those views, and then other people who are saying, well, why are you trying to prevent me from going to this park? Or why are you criticizing me for leaving my home, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think there needs to be, I understand any decisions have to be evidence-based and well-informed by the science, but there needs to be a better coordination of the messaging from the federal government, in my view, who have a leadership role to play, and then through to their provincial and municipal partners. And we had a lot of inconsistent messaging from all levels of government at the outset of this pandemic, from my perspective, on behalf of the members that I represent.
Merci, Monsieur Paulus. We go now to Dr. Jaksek. Dr. Jaksek, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I certainly want to thank all the witnesses for their very thoughtful comments. And in a situation like we find ourselves now, it's so important to, in fact, work together and look to the future and find out how we could do better if we should ever face this dreadful situation again. My first question is for Monsieur Tanguy. Monsieur Tanguy, you have talked a lot about the Government Operations Centre's mandate of collaboration, close coordination with provinces and territories and their emergency operations centres. But we've also heard from Mr. Stamatakis and Mr. Wilkins that there's a great deal of frustration for their members operating in different provinces and territories, that the message is coming, whether in your case it's mostly acquisition of personal protective equipment, but also with the public health messaging, that this is a very frustrating situation when there is a lack of consistency across Canada. So from your perspective, and we've heard this sort of comment obviously in this committee before, should there be stronger measures taken federally to ensure consistency as opposed to your current very collaborative process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the questions. A few comments on that front. I believe, and we heard it from all provinces and territories and other partners, and also from different federal ministers and the Prime Minister, that has been an incredible collaboration between different governments. And that collaboration has made it possible that we coordinate our actions. Obviously, each jurisdictions will make decisions within their own powers. But at the same time, I believe that we can always do better. But I believe that the information sharing, the fact that we played this enabling role at the federal level in bringing, whether it's the emergency management table or the health table, I think it's crucial. And I believe that we should continue to focus in working together, all different governments at all levels, including municipal, just to make sure that we do an even better job in coordinations. But I believe that's the right track to follow.
And following up on that, we've heard, and I will be asking the Public Health Agency of Canada a question as well, but from your perspective, in terms of when you get requests for proposals for equipment to provide surge capacity in this regard, do you how do you coordinate that? The stockpile is housed within the Public Health Agency of Canada. You also have military opportunity stockpiles there. What exactly is the process that you use to first use up the stockpile before procurement? Or could you just elaborate on how this actually works?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The way it works is, and we have to think about a government operation center as a platform. So all the subject matter experts are coming, we're working together. So in the case of the PPEs or the personal protective equipment, for instance, we would turn and work under the leadership of departments, Public Health Agency and the Health Department. But also in terms of coordinations, and we've done it. My minister has been reaching out to provinces and territories to find out about the needs on that front. And I've done it at my level, and we make sure to share that information with our colleagues over at the Public Health Agency and the Health Department, because there was an initiative to be coordinating internally within the federal system under the leadership of those two entities. So I would suggest that maybe my colleague, Sally Thornton, could complement, the answer here.
Thank you. And so, Ms. Thornton, could you, from your perspective, how do you liaise with the Government Operations Centre You hinted at the end of your statement a little bit about what the nests would look like going forward. You had a stockpile. Presumably, it wasn't sufficient to accommodate the surge capacity needed out in the field. So you needed to work with Procurement Canada. Just describe to us how this works.
So if I may, again, realizing our focus is very much on PPE for the health sector, one of the first things we did is we're not that familiar with what provinces had in their respective stockpiles. So very quickly, we got a heads up in terms of where there would be national gaps and international. We made a decision to do bulk procurement simply because we've got a competitive advantage when we go out with bulk procurement. So we put out a number of orders through procurement, Public Services Procurement Canada for the things that we knew were going to be in short supply, such as your N95, masks, gowns. The bulk procurement gave us an advantage. When we receive these, we actually allocate to our provincial and territorial counterparts in the health service sector two things. One, there's sort of a base amount that goes just to make sure that they've got some supply in terms of planning and preparedness. But the initial requests for assistance really deal with urgent needs. So our provincial and territorial counterparts, they know what they have in stock. They're getting more familiar with their burn rates, i.e. if I have 25,000 medical masks, I need more Saturday. And that is for our priority distribution. So in many instances, it is a just-in-time, complemented by where there aren't such acute shortages by getting things pre-positioned for longer term. And that's really how we're working now with our procurement folks and our provincial and territorial counterparts. But our distribution either comes to the nest first and then to our provincial and territorial counterparts, or depending on the origin of the supply, it can be directed. It doesn't have to come through the nest. It can go directly where the needs are.
Thank you, Dr. Jaksic. Nous allons maintenant à Monsieur.
We are now going to move to Mr. Thériault. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate your effort. You have a very nice French accent. So my question is for the correctional officers. Earlier, you said that we had to act to take into account the additional risks from this virus, and there were 3 fronts: testing, PPEs, and planning processes. On April 21st in Joliette, we had 51 inmates that tested positive on 130 inmates. The Centre Fédéral de Formation in Laval has 49 confirmed cases, 14 in Port-Cartier. So that's 114 confirmed cases in the inmate population for 188 tests that were conducted. First of all, do you think that this is enough? Do you think that there's a lack of testing, or has that problem been solved? And do your agents currently have enough PPEs to do their work? Because we saw that in closed living quarters, sometimes they can become spreaders.
Thank you. First, I guess I'll address the protective equipment question. We have not been given any indication by the Correctional Service that there's a lack of personal protective equipment. Our questions are often where that is going to be used. So when I spoke about the planning in my opening comments, the contingencies and all of these things that need to be discussed at the local level as to when the virus comes, what's going to happen. When I talk about the personal protective equipment, it's when you use it. So It's only now that it's coming down to the field through our health and safety committees that we're determining the levels of PPE that are required in certain situations. So if you have an inmate who is tested positive for COVID or symptomatic for COVID, of course, the response to come into contact with that inmate is far different than when I'm able to keep a social distance. So I can tell you that the personal protective equipment, it's not been flagged to us that there is, there's not enough stock. It's our question is where it's used. When it comes to the testing, of course, we know that the 188 tests that you say, just for those institutions alone, of course, those inmates that are being symptomatic or are expressing symptoms are being tested. And in my opening comments, I referred to the testing being a priority. And what I mean for that is public health comes into the institution once somebody tests positive for COVID. And they do a contact tracing. And those officers that might have been around an inmate or another staff member are told to go home, and self-isolate for 14 days. They're asymptomatic, but they're not able to get a test in the province to which they live because they don't have any symptoms. So they have to stay at home for 14 days. And the problem that we are having is what blew up very rapidly first at Port Cartier Institution was a significant majority of our staff members were sent home to self-isolate. So now the members are forced to create different schedules and work excessive hours of work just to keep the front line strong. So when I say that testing is an important piece, of course, for the inmate population to make sure, but also for correctional officers when they're sent home.
Vous avez.
Unless I misunderstood, you said earlier that some members had to go back to work before having test results. Could you explain to us why that was the case? And is that still going on today? Are you still making people come back to work without having test results?
Of course, this concern got raised to us through from Mission Institution. When Mission Institution, they have a very high rate of inmates that are infected now. As of today, I do believe it's 64 inmates. They have 9 staff and 1 other staff member besides a correctional officer. Again, it came down to the contact tracing. So they did all the contact tracing. They sent entire group of individuals home to self-isolate for 14 days on the advice of public health. And what we were seeing there was the site, because of the staffing concern and not the unwillingness to bring staff from other institutions in for a period of time on a voluntary basis and pay things such as overtime or whatever is required. They were calling up the people that were off at home and saying, look, it's been 6 days. We don't feel that the contact tracing, went a little too far. You're able to come back to work. And believe it or not, one of the officers that they asked to come back to work, the day after they asked him to come to work, he tested positive for COVID. So you can imagine what kind of impact that would have had he had come back into the workplace. Your question is it continuing today? Not as far as I'm aware. I think we've solved that issue.
Merci, Monsieur Thériault.
Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Mr. Davies, please go ahead. 6 minutes.
Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Stamatakis, first to you. Of course, I live in Vancouver, where you have been had a long and great career with Vancouver Police Department. I reached out to some of your members in advance of this meeting and asked what their challenges and concerns were. And I want to read you one response I got. The VPD officer said, most of my challenges and concerns are mostly answered with just wear PPE and you're going to get it eventually. The reality of working in the front line is I'm not able to avoid high-risk interactions when it comes to COVID, and I feel like it's just assumed by the government that we will get it and to suck it up. I personally don't disagree with that assertion, but I know it makes lots of my coworkers who have elderly relatives at home much more nervous. Numerous times I've had to deal with situations without PPE, as without my immediate intervention, there could have been bodily harm or more. The current answer to that afterward is keep coming back to work until you show symptoms. Couple that with constantly having to attend SROs at an increasing rate, working in close contact with people who have drug and mental issues that make even basic hygiene out of the question, and sharing all my equipment, there is no end. I'm just wondering, Mr. Stamatakis, given that jurisdictions like New York City, where 4,000 members of the NYPD have tested positive for COVID-19 and about 15% of the uniformed workforce is out sick, do you have any similar concerns of that with respect to your membership?
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, that's why in my opening remarks, I tried to emphasize that one of the challenges of policing in this environment, in this very sort of unprecedented environment, is exactly what that officer that you were in contact with described to you. We often don't know who we're dealing with, and we don't know, we have little control over the environment within which we're interacting with people. So, I mean, these are very real concerns, and that's why the level of anxiety for police personnel through this pandemic has been so heightened, because, you know, we try and put protocols in place to try and mitigate the risk as much as possible, whether that's through the issuing of PPEs or changing how we respond to different calls, minimizing the number of times that we might be interacting with the public where we maybe would normally interact with them in normal circumstances, but now we don't because we want to try and prevent police officers from being exposed. It's a very, very real issue, and I think the approach we've taken is to try and raise issues when they've come up. I think the approach we're taking now is we're trying to identify some of the concerns that we've had to try and look sort of prospectively to how can we address these in the future or as this thing continues. And to that end, you know, I've had, you know, good lines of communication with Minister Blair and Public Safety Canada, who have been responsive to some of the issues that we've raised. But look, it is an unprecedented situation, and what that officer describes is what officers are experiencing right across the country. We're fortunate in Canada that we've had few officers. We've had officers in almost every jurisdiction test positive, but they haven't been significant numbers. Where we've been more challenged is officers who have been exposed and then have to self-isolate, and then you have to manage the deployment issues that arise from that. And then we manage that through, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks, the need for testing and easy access to medical professionals that can give our members good advice. And for the most part, in most jurisdictions, we do have access to advice from medical professionals that we're trying to take advantage of.
Thank you. Mr. Tanguay, Minister Blair, at a news conference said that literally hundreds of federal inmates have been granted early release in response to COVID-19 outbreak. Could you inform the committee of both how many inmates have applied for early or exceptional release because of COVID-19 and how many have been released to date?
Mr. Tanguay, your microphone is muted.
Do you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I was saying that this is outside my area of responsibility, and I would take this back, and we can provide the information, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Thornton, on April 1, Federal Health Minister Patty Hajdu admitted that the federal government likely did not have enough protective equipment in the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. To quote her, "We likely did not have enough. I think federal governments for decades have been underfunding things like public health preparedness." Two questions. Would you advise this committee that federal governments have been underfunding NEST for decades? And at any time in the last 10 years, has PHAC warned the federal government that NEST has been underfunded?
I may, in my opening remarks, I did talk about the gradual evolution of the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. And it has evolved from wartime to current time, right before the pandemic, with various phases and various types of funding. It does not have a large budget when I look compared to my international colleagues or even with some of my domestic partners. It has been funded for what it was asked to do, however. It was not asked to prepare beyond surge capacity for provinces and territories. With hindsight, one could always like more. One would always wish that in the future, however this goes forward, as we do the preparedness and we identify the risks and what's required to address those risks, that the budget allocation is proportionate to allow us to meet that.
Thank you. I know that in
Mr. Davies, you're at 1 second. You're at your time right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll go now to, that ends our first round of questions. We start now our second round of questions with Ms. Jansen. Ms. Jansen, please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. A question for Ms. Thornton. I want to clarify, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile is separate from provincial stockpile.
Ms. Jansen, your microphone, I think, needs to be deployed properly.
Sorry, did that again. So, Ms. Thornton, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile, is that separate from the provincial stockpiles?
Absolutely. Every province, yes.
So then my question to you is what quantity of masks were on hand at the start of, in NES, at the start of this pandemic?
We would have to follow up on that number.
Okay, if I could get that number. Now, yesterday we heard from Mr. Matthews that he's ordered more than 293 million surgical masks. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, you know, how long will it, at the current burn rate, how long will those last?
For that number, we'd have to do calculations on burn rate. I would just caution that a procurement order is not the same as what we receive.
Okay. So then my next question is in regards to stock rotation, how often do you offer PPE for sale per year in order to help rotate that stock that you have in the stockpile?
We don't offer it for sale, but we will distribute it.
Okay, how often does that happen? And that goes to the provinces, I'm assuming?
Not necessarily. We've had cases, particularly third world countries, during the Ebola outbreak. I've got, let me just grab my list.
Okay, no, that's all right. Sorry. So your stock rotation, you give it away as it gets close to expiry. Do you immediately restock when you do that?
Depending on the nature of the item, yes.
And how often does that happen?
Antivirals, which is where we are active in terms, happen regularly.
And how about the masks?
Annually.
How about the masks?
I would have to confirm that.
Right, because I think you mentioned like the masks were 5 years old. Is that correct?
The ones in the Regina warehouse, we had kept well beyond their expiry date, and normally we would not keep them that long.
Okay, and so who's in charge then of stock rotation? How does that work? How could those have gotten left out like that?
I am in charge of stock rotation. Typically, we do keep things that could work a bit beyond their expiry if we're not able to donate them, such as our donations for Hurricane Harvey to Texas or to the Ebola outbreak.
So what would be the total of donations in the last 5 years on those PPE?
Well, in 2014, for the West African Ebola outbreak, it was about $2.68 million worth. That included N95 respirators, gloves, coveralls. For Hurricane Harvey to Texas in 2017, it was about $10,000. And that was really beds, blankets, pillowcases, bath towels.
And so then I guess the question is did that all get restocked? Because I'm assuming you had it in the stockpile because you needed it.
We keep a minimum level in terms of our beds, blankets, PPEs. Our focus in terms of our rotation is on the antivirals and meds.
Okay, so what is your minimum level of stock on masks?
I would have to. I can tell you, we will be able to get you the numbers on what we had prior to going in.
Okay,
but I couldn't tell you our minimal.
Okay. And then I was just wondering, what part do you play in regards to the procurement? Because Bill Matthews yesterday mentioned that PPE is being checked in China and inspected in China before it ships, and then inspected again in Canada. And then we found out from Ms. Hadju, I think there was a bunch of masks that recently got shipped that were not usable. So how does that work?
So there are two things. First, at the outset, in placing the orders for the procurement, we actually work to identify the specifications for those items that would be acceptable, usable, and meet our standards, or alternatives that we're not accustomed to, but that would also meet our standards and protect the healthcare workers. There is often a preliminary inspection in China, but we receive things here and we have to inspect them.
So do you expect, though, that if you're inspecting in China, you wouldn't necessarily have masks still arriving in Canada that were not usable?
It would depend on the nature of the broker or the type of procurement. We're dealing with a bunch of different suppliers. So when things come here, one, we do a visual inspection first. So, for instance, you look at a mask, you can tell if there are perforations where there shouldn't be. You pull the elastic, it can pop.
Right, but are you doing that in China? I guess that was the question that I had for Mr. Matthews, and he said yes. And then we find out that masks have arrived and they're not usable. Pardon?
They have, but also things can easily pass a visual, but then we have to take them for lab testing, and that's just to check whether what goes through the mask, the permeability, both in terms of airflow and liquid.
And those tests cannot be done in China? I know there's lots of labs in China.
Yeah, we do prefer to do them here. It's good to have our National Research Council, our own testing, and our own engineers taking a look at it. Very cautious about what we'd send out to healthcare workers and don't want them to be inadvertently put in a
right. But would it maybe help you avoid having things get shipped that are not up to snuff? If you did a test first in China and then you can test again when they arrive here?
The greater the quality control in China, definitely, the better the quality we would receive here.
Absolutely, absolutely. How much time do I have left?
You're right on the line right now.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you very much. We go now to Mr. Kellaway. Mr. Kellaway, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and hello, colleagues and witnesses. I would just like to thank everyone for their kind words towards my province of Nova Scotia. It's been a difficult time. With that in mind, I just want to thank the Police Association and the Corrections Association for all that you've done, all that you do, and all that you will do. And as someone who's married into a police family, my father-in-law was former chief of police here in Cape Breton, and my brother-in-law is the current chief of police, and a lot of nephews that are in law enforcement. Your efforts have never been more appreciated than during COVID, but especially certainly during this time that we're going through in Nova Scotia with the shootings in Cumberland County. My question, I have three questions. The first two are for the Canadian Police Association. I'll be succinct on the first one and hopefully equally on the second one. So what particular challenges are you facing on the front lines, and what more can be done? You talked about the lack of communication or coordination between levels of government. I'm wondering if you can unpack maybe some more challenges so we can look to where we can improve and what more can be done.
Well, I think it's really important for the messaging to be consistent, starting with the federal government, and that's why I think the federal government's got a leadership role, and then on through all of our provincial health officers and our elected officials provincially, and then further through to the municipal level, because one of the challenges in Canada with some of the jurisdictional issues is you've got, each province making their own announcements, and that information is then trickling on down to the people in the front line who are interacting with the public, and the public are either receiving different messages or messages at a different pace. And so when the police then are expected to take enforcement action or engage with them, when the messaging is inconsistent, then that creates conflict. And the last thing I think we need in circumstances like this, or in any circumstances, is more conflict between the public and the police. I think we should have the opposite, and that's why I think one thing that's been done really well is this focus on education and encouragement rather than taking an enforcement approach first. And I think that was a good strategy. And finally, when we got that messaging and it was consistently being delivered from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and province to province, I think it was effective.
Thanks so much. And I kind of want to dovetail that question and answer to this question. Do you find that there's an increased compliance with laws when warnings are issued rather than pursuing arrests? Because, as you said, there is more now a focus of looking at educating the public, obviously laying charges where there's serious cases, but playing more of a role on education. So do you see an increased compliance with the laws when the warnings are issued rather than pursuing arrests? Is it too soon to tell? Or what's the feeling among the rank and file in your association on that?
Hey, look, from my perspective, education's always the best first approach, and we have to realize that we turned our society upside down literally overnight. We told citizens right across the country that they couldn't do things that they'd always been able to do. We had businesses that were being closed down, people struggling with the loss of their livelihoods, people losing their jobs, and I think in the midst of that, we needed to give people more information and focus on education as opposed to taking a very strident enforcement approach, particularly when most of these citizens that we're dealing with are normally law-abiding,
yes,
tax-paying people that are all also suffering from a high level of anxiety because of what's happening in our country.
No question. The level of anxiety is high, especially among law enforcement. So I appreciate that, sir. My next question is for corrections. What protocols are taken for corrections officers who are symptomatic? And if you can dig a little deeper, Ed, in terms of what leave options and support are being provided to those individuals.
Well, that was a challenge that we faced early in the COVID response with the Treasury Board of Canada. That originally, that if somebody was symptomatic and before going to work, called the institution, they were going to have to use their own sick leave to go. And of course, we're in allergy season, we're in flu season, and if I wake up and I have a little bit of a sneeze or a cough, I might not necessarily call in sick. I probably go to work thinking that it might be allergies. But in this realm here now, that mindset has changed. So, and it was very important because the message had to be very clear that if you're not feeling well, you feel any symptoms, you should not be going into the workplace. In order for that to come around, now if somebody is symptomatic, they will be given special paid leave by the Treasury Board to stay home for the 14-day period. Again, this is where testing becomes vitally important because not everybody can go home.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Kellaway.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
We go now to Dr. Kitchen. Dr. Kitchen, please go ahead. 5 minutes. Dr. Kitchen, you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. I saw Marcus tapping his ear. I should have caught faster. Thanks. Sorry. Thank you all for being here today and appreciate that. Your comments have been greatly appreciated, and we've heard from many groups that have presented to us. And one of the common things that I'm hearing is that we weren't prepared. Mr. Wilkins, you talked about proper steps not being taken right from the start. Mr. Stamaticus, your comments about the communication and how that's hasn't been put out there. And it appears that we have silos, but these silos aren't communicating such that everything is put out at the same time for everybody. And that obviously is challenging when we look at the Public Health Association, and I appreciate your comments on giving us the history as we've developed to where we are today. But we need to be ahead of the game. And a lot of times we are actually reacting instead of being proactive in what we should be doing. Mr. Tanguay, my first question to you is, we've heard many times that within the healthcare sector, one of the biggest barriers to addressing COVID-19 is a lack of information or a lack of transparency from the provinces and territories with respect to data. Has the public safety identified any issues with obtaining data from the provinces so that preparations and precautions can be scaled to the severity of the situation in each jurisdiction?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I think I would defer to my colleagues over at Public Health Agency because when it comes to the health sector, that information, that data was collected, by Health Canada and Public Health Agency.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Cindy Evans speaking. Maybe I'll just speak to very early on in our process, we make use of our federal, provincial, and territorial mechanisms. And so as early as December 31st, our Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Tam, engaged with the Canadian Council of Medical Officers of Health. And in addition, as part of our federal, provincial, territorial response plan for biological events, we very early on put in place a special advisory committee, and they've been meeting regularly 2 and 3 times a week since January with a very effective sharing of information. Noting the point of the different timelines in which public health measures came on board in the various provinces. There was very great sharing across the table in terms of consistency of the public health measures that were needed for provinces and territories to work cooperatively, recognizing that infectious diseases don't respect borders, either international or provincial borders. And so I guess I would say in terms of receiving information, even to the extent of discussing case definition for how we would define active cases, the amount of information that was necessary to be received so that we could accurately reflect Canada's situation, I would say that the information sharing from the provinces was quite strong and started quite early. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I thought I'm hearing from public safety that you're looking at aspects of PPE and you're referring to PHAC for that information. Yet PHAC is looking after NES. And so if they're looking after NES but PHAC is saying this is purely for the health sector, how is it that public safety is looking at the use of NES equipment, or how can they, and when PHAC is actually administering it strictly for healthcare? Sorry, your microphone's off, Mr. Tanguay.
I'm sorry about this. So, Mr. Chair, yes, but to complement that work, what has been done is a vast work done by different departments. For instance, we've been reaching out to provinces and territories ourselves to be finding out about what are the needs of PPEs outside of the health sector. We did that last week, and what we heard from provinces, for instance, is that in Alberta and others that they had PPEs in stock for 45 to 60 days, that they were the good positions that they were procuring. But we're not just doing this. What we're doing with colleagues over at PSPC and other departments, we're looking at the needs, for instance, of other sectors, not just first responders, but for essential workers, for instance, and trying to come up with the needs that are required over there.
And I appreciate that, but we're hearing different results from other groups about not having that information. So I guess I have one last question, hopefully quickly.
Dr. Kitchen, you're right on time right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks, folks, for being here today. I appreciate you here with your expert testimony. Mr. Tanguay, you had been before this committee on February 3rd, and at that time you had indicated that Government Operations Center had progressed through levels 1, which is enhanced monitoring and reporting, and 2, which is risk assessment and planning, and at that time you were operating at level 3. I wonder if you could, for the committee, describe levels 1 through 3, what they are, and when and why the Government Operations Center might proceed from one level to the next.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So for level 1, for instance, at level 1, the Government Operations Center will develop detailed authoritative reporting of significant information from a multitude of sources about the event and disseminates to federal emergency response partners to support their planning or response effort. For level 2, the Government Operations Center will start producing enhanced reporting, conducts a risk assessment, then guides the development of a strategic plans for an integrated response if required. Moving to level 3, the Government Operations Center serves as the coordination center for the federal response and provides regular situations reports as well as briefing, decision-making support materials for ministers and seniors officials. This includes enhanced reporting and risk assessment and planning as required.
Are there other levels beyond 3? And if so, maybe describe them. And, have you moved beyond level 3 in the past? And I'm thinking, Nova Scotia was hit quite hard by Hurricane Dorian. And I'm wondering if, what Hurricane Dorian might have been as far as a measurement of levels.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have more than 3 levels to activate the Government Operations Center. Dorian, if my memory is right, happened in the last September. And at that point, we activated at level 3 to be coordinating a response and working with lead departments, because the way that the Government Operations Center works is using the federal emergency response plans. And then we work with different lead departments. We'll be providing some support functions. In that case, what was requested was from the Canadian Armed Forces.
Okay. I'll switch to Mr. Stamatakis. Sir, I want to thank you very much for your kind words at your opening with regards to our lost RCMP officer here in my community. And I want to thank you, if you could pass along to all your members my thanks for policing. You talked about a level of anxiety with regards to policing, and I can't imagine being in your partner's shoes right now. So folks traveling and entering into Canada right now must self-isolate for 14 days. That's a mandatory isolation through the minimizing the risk of exposure to COVID-19 in Canada order. So the RCMP is playing a coordination role for all Canadian law enforcement. So I guess, how is the RCMP ensuring that relevant information with regards to the Quarantine Act is communicated to every Canadian law enforcement agency?
I guess the best way I can answer that question is I'll just use my own home service as an example, where we have seconded local police officers to an integrated unit that is led by the RCMP to manage those quarantine situations in the province of British Columbia. So, and I believe, although I'm not 100% sure, the same thing has happened in every province. So that is how the government, through the RCMP, is making sure that information is known to local agencies, and that integrated unit or secondment unit will communicate out to the different police services where there are people quarantined as a result of travel and that kind of thing.
So is information being provided to all law enforcement agencies about everyone subject to the quarantine or the isolation order, or only about people that are suspected of perhaps non-compliance?
So that's an issue, and I'm glad you asked the question, because one of the challenges we are having across jurisdictions is knowing not only where people on the front line, these are officers who are working every day interacting with people, knowing on the front line where people are quarantined, and just as importantly, or more importantly, arguably for my members from a health and safety perspective, we're not getting information about where people are residing that are infected. And obviously, you want to be respectful of those persons' privacy and deal with all those related issues. But at the same time, I think it's important for police officers who are responding to know what they're responding to, not only so that you can reduce the anxiety that I'm talking about, but also so that they can be responding appropriately. So do they need to don the PPEs before they enter the premise, or
well, and you've got
interaction with people?
Thank you,
you've
Mr.
got
Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Nous allons maintenant à Monsieur Thériault.
Now, Mr. Thériault, you have 2 minutes and a half. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question is for the Public Health Agency of Canada. Ms. Thornton, in your conclusion, after having told us about the stockpile, after having told us why this, why that, in your conclusion, you said that responding to this pandemic needed new approaches and non-traditional partnerships. So if you could give us 3 recommendations regarding what should have been done or what we should do in the future, what would be these recommendations?
Am I off mute? Okay. So, no, thank you very much for that question. I guess there are really 3 areas. In terms of the partnerships, I would love to see a stronger, sustained relationship with the Canadian Red Cross. They have been invaluable in providing services at a community level and helping outreach. They've got an understanding of what happens on the ground and an awareness that bridges beyond simply the public health element, but also with some of the other concerns with our vulnerable communities, where the issues they're facing and how to best address them. While we are dealing largely with a public health issue, it is making some of the more difficult issues that vulnerable people in communities are facing, and organizations such as the Red Cross have real value there. To see them in some sort of more formalized working arrangement would be incredibly valuable. We have had phenomenal collaborative relationships with our provinces and territories. I have never seen organizations come together so quickly, so thoroughly, so openly. On the health front, that has been a real bonus. It does reflect years of planning. This is not something that just happened because of this pandemic, but it's happened since SARS. We've been doing a lot of pandemic planning and a lot of preparedness work with them. I do think that we do need to actually have broader exercises, understanding the implications of public health on other areas of the economy. So not quite as insular as the public health, but leveraging that approach, that collaboration, those types of exercises, and taking it broader, engaging more in terms of the groups that Patrick Tanga is working with in that area. And I guess the third thing is really, as we look to the future, understanding the implications of a public health event such as this on national security. We tend to deal with public health as something off to the side. We are seeing now the impacts of this, not just on people, on supply chains, on ability to bring in food across the border, agriculture, every economy. I do think one of the things that's come out that's very strong was the recent call to action. While I'm dealing with procurement with suppliers who may exist, there's been a call to action to private sector, private businesses to actually build capacity in Canada to deal with public health requirements, PPE. But I do think we have to understand that that's something we need to sustain and build into a broader, longer-term strategy as we move forward.
Merci, Monsieur Thériault. We go now.
Thank you, Mr. Thériault.
Please, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Ms. Thornton, you referenced the NES budget. Can you undertake to provide this committee with the amount of funding that the federal government has provided for the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile for each of the last 10 years?
I will do our very best. Some of that is not publicly available for disclosure, but most of it is actually through our public accounts materials, and we'll share that. And if I could also just respond to an
Sorry, that's okay. No, I have limited time, please. Sorry, what would be confidential about the amount of federal tax dollars that the federal government provides to a National Emergency Strategic Stockpile?
Nothing is confidential about the amount that is provided. It's all in the public accounts, and we're happy to provide that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Number 2, in 2010, the Audit of Emergency Preparedness and Response flagged inadequate record keeping as particularly concerning problem with the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. They said it was unclear how much of the stockpile was up to date and what quantity of the goods had expired. I'll quote from that report. NES does not have reliable, useful life information for the majority of its supplies stored at the main warehouse, the regional warehouses, or the pre-positioned sites. The creation of an electronic database might solve the problem, end quote. Has PHAC created an electronic database to manage the NES records? And if so, when was that put into place?
So yes, we have. I'm not quite sure about the date, but a number of our locations are actually certified under good manufacturing processes, and we have regular audits now. So our latest compliance certificate.
You don't know when that electronic database was put into place?
I don't actually have the dates.
Could you undertake to advise the committee of that as well, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. And the 2010 audit of emergency preparedness also questioned whether the stockpile contained enough of the right supplies for an emergency. Again, to quote, NES acquisitions in recent past have also been driven by established budgets and available funds, as opposed to being based on a more comprehensive needs analysis. Has PHAC conducted a comprehensive needs analysis to ensure that NES contained a sufficient stockpile of the supplies necessary to respond to a pandemic outbreak?
Our focus after that was all hazards, but also primarily geared towards chemical, radiological, biological, and nuclear events, and looking at antivirals. So that was the priority, that was the mandate, and there we are well positioned.
I think the question more is, do you use a comprehensive needs analysis?
Thank you, Mr. Davids.
Sorry, perhaps the witness can just answer the question.
We use an all hazards approach in assessment. It's slightly different. We look at the priorities and what's likely and what we would require then.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great. That brings round two to a close. Nous allons maintenant, Monsieur.
We'll now start the third round with Mr. Paulus. Mr. Paulus, you have the floor. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Tanguy. We were talking about essential services and 10 sectors. Minister Blair tabled a plan regarding health and safety and transportation. So there could also be cyber attacks for businesses and individuals. Could he tell us what the most critical sectors are right now for essential services? Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can get back to you with more clarification on this question. Okay, it would be good to know it quickly in order to know what we need to focus on. And maybe for my first question at the first round, maybe the information regarding the border and asylum seekers. We know that there's a hotel in Saint-Bernard that's been leased. We'd like to know how much that costs, and are there other such sites in Canada, or is it just in La Colle? Mr. Wilkins, for institutions. We have colleagues around the virtual table that talked about different problems. I'd like to get back to inmates. Mr. Stamatakis said that to release inmates in the community was not a good thing, considering that we already have another situation. So, for the inmate population, we know in Joliette or in Mission, is it a good thing to keep them or should they be released?
From a lot of different outside agencies for the release of inmates, but it doesn't solve our problem. The need to protect in place is there. It's not like we can open the doors and let every inmate out. I know that they're looking at inmates that are very close to their parole eligibility, or in fact eligible for day parole, and inmates that pose a less significant risk. But it's not going to solve the problem when the virus enters the institutions. And I would hope that everybody could understand that that's not the solution to the problem. The solution to the problem is being able to quarantine quickly, the personal protective equipment, the cleaning of the institutions, the protecting in place. That's essentially what needs to happen.
Donc, il y a des moyens de...
So, some other measures could be put in place quickly to avoid releasing inmates who would then become police services problems. So it was already said before that this was not a great idea. So I'd like to get back to Mr. Stamatakis or public safety. Now we've been talking about coordination. If the Emergency Measures Act had been put in place, would that have changed anything on your procedures? Or would the current problems would be the same? Maybe we could start with Mr. Tanguy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the Emergency Measures Act, I'm not a legal expert, but the act is crafted, we have to reach some thresholds for it to be useful. It's good to know that sometimes we have no levers in place. The goal is not necessarily to add, but to complement. So, of course, consultations are being held with provinces and territories, and we have to ask them if there's anything that could be solved by adopting such a measure. So what we're told now is that it's not the case. And there's a test in the Act that says we cannot make the situation worse for provinces and territories by adding additional measures. Thank you. I think my time's up. You have 30 seconds if you wish. Well, I'd like the analysts to take note that the Senate committee in 2008 did a study of 250 pages on emergency preparedness, and they had many recommendations. And if those recommendations had been put in place, we could have avoided many problems that we see currently.
Sir, merci, Monsieur Paulus. We go now.
Thank you, Mr. Paulus.
5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to the Police Association. Thank you, all the frontliner, what you are doing. With everyone staying home, we are hearing many reports of increased case of domestic violence. In York region, domestic violence increased by 22%. Vancouver Crisis Line received 300% increase in domestic violence calls over 3 weeks period. Also, we are hearing about stunt driving. Can you tell us about what kind of the difficulties are you facing given the strain on resources? Also speak about what kind of support provided to those who are fleeing from domestic violence.
Yes, through this pandemic, we have seen some changes to crime patterns. We're certainly seeing, decreases in some areas. So, your typical sort of traffic offenses, residential B&Es, increases though in terms of violent crime, domestic violence. Commercial B&Es is a significant problem in most cities across the country. And they pose challenges. Domestic violence in particular is a significant challenge because, of course, you're responding to incidents in people's homes. There's all the implications that go around that. And often we're needing to interact with victims of violence. There are often children involved, and it's a difficult situation, particularly in the midst of a pandemic. And it's not easy to provide comfort or to get statements or to be responsive to the needs of children when you're wearing personal protective equipment or having to social distance in those circumstances. So it is a challenge. It does create a significant strain, particularly because many of the resources that are available to assist people in those difficult circumstances are also challenged themselves with resources and the inability to maintain their typical locations for victims of domestic violence. So it's a very, very real challenge. We do try and connect victims of domestic violence with appropriate resources, victim resources, or put them in touch with the various facilities that are available in communities across the country. But it is a significant challenge in an area that requires continued attention, particularly as we continue in this situation in this country.
My next question is to Union of Canadian Correctional Officers. I'm from Brampton South, and it was announced recently in Brampton jails closed due to an outbreak of COVID-19. And we're also concerned by the outbreak in Mission Institution, where confirmed numbers amongst inmates are above 60, and many officers have also been impacted. We also heard from your testimony, you said testing is important, and numbers of our staff stay, they have to stay in 14 days in isolation. And I'm also curious about the mental health of correctional officers and the prison community as a whole. What is the support for the mental health in correction for the correctional officers or the community as a whole?
Thank you, Chair. The supports that we have in place in the institutions, we have, of course, the Employee Assistance Program. Also, you know, if there's critical incidents, the critical incident stress management team that is engaged, and you know, most of the times these things can be deemed that. You know, I think that I set it off right from the very beginning with my membership that mental health is going to be something that we're going to need to focus on now, and also most particularly in the wake of this crisis. We're continuing to be, you know, in our communities, locked down in our communities, and not being able to freely associate with one another. And in places like Mission, officers are working extended hours in the workplace because of a lack of resources, a lack of other staff. You know, we are seeing some outpourings from the community, bringing sandwiches and recognizing the work that's happening there. And we are supporting one another in the workplace. But really, for the things that are in place from the Government of Canada, the Correctional Services, the EAP, and CISM.
Okay, Ms. Sadu. We go now to Mr. Genereux. Mr. Genereux, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Questions are for the Public Health Agency. You would agree with me that the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile was set up to backstop the country's healthcare system in emergencies such as infectious disease outbreaks, natural disasters, and other public health events such as a pandemic?
So it was intended as surge capacity. Provinces and municipalities are sort of the first line, and yes, some surge capacity there.
Sorry, that's directly from your website. Canada's National Emergency Strategic Stockpile contains supplies that provinces and territories can request in emergencies such as infectious disease outbreaks, natural disasters, and other public health events. So you would agree with me? That's perfect. That contradicts what Dr. Tam said, where she said the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile system was not really set to backstop the entire country's healthcare system. Second question, you said earlier that you didn't know the details of the province's supply. On what date did you get the heads up on gaps in procurement?
So first, if I could just go back, I'm not sure what the difference is between surge capacity and backstop, but it is.
I have very little time, if you don't mind addressing this question.
It's been an ongoing discussion with the provinces and the territories over the last, I guess, 4 or 6 weeks. We've begun to become more aware of what they have, or more importantly, what they don't have and what they need.
Sorry, you said earlier that you didn't know the details, but then you were provided the details. So the date where you provided the details and gaps in procurement?
It's been an ongoing process and an ongoing exchange with the provinces and territories who have different structures internally, and they've been providing with Health Canada as the lead. They've actually been providing.
Would that have been before February or after February 1st?
After February 1st.
After February 1st. So there's no inquiry with the provinces and gaps in procurement prior to February 1st. In documents obtained by the committee, a briefing note dated February 10th, 2020 mentions that Public Health Agency started conducting a PPE survey on provinces and territory supplies for area of vulnerability to ensure sufficient supply. What date did that survey begin?
I would have to confirm the date. That was through the Logistics Advisory Committee, which reports to the FPT Special Advisory Committee. And yes, they did start that. And I do think it was early February around that date. I'm just not sure the exact date.
Say before or after February 4th. Could you confirm?
I would have to confirm that date.
Could you provide the committee with the results of that survey conducted?
I will see what the availability is. Yes, absolutely.
In the same document dated February 10th, 2020, it was disclosed that the NESS is able to secure modest supplies of surgical masks and N95 masks with deliveries staggered due to mounting market pressure. 10 days prior, the Public Health Agency said that shipping supplies to China would not affect Canada's supplies. Would you agree that earlier statements made by the Public Health Agency that shipping these supplies to China did not affect Canada's supply?
Yes, I would.
Is it safe then to assume that the NESS was not properly monitored and stocked by the Public Health Agency of Canada?
The NESS had been actually monitored and stocked as it was mandated and funded to do.
Would you agree then that we failed to keep an adequate stockpile due to lack of attention and poor inventory based on your earlier comments?
No, the NESS was actually doing well what it was actually mandated and funded to do.
You mentioned that we didn't have adequate. Sorry, the minister mentioned that we didn't have adequate stockpile, and you said it's not due to lack of intention or poor inventory. So then, what's it due to?
I think it was actually delivering on what it had been mandated and funded to do.
But the minister said it was inadequate. So why was it inadequate?
The focus had been on preparation for CBRN events, chemical, biological, radionuclear events.
But then back to my first question, was these were set up in emergencies such as infectious disease outbreaks, natural disasters, and other public health events, which you confirmed would be something like a pandemic.
Yes, and our focus at that point, based on the more recent evaluations, was on preparation stocking of antivirals.
But in preparation for a pandemic, and we had inadequate supplies.
The focus had been on antivirals. With hindsight, would I have liked it to have been different, but we were not mandated or funded to do this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. General. We go now to Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Van Bynen, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to continue my discussions again around the PHAC group and public safety. I think we all admit that we're facing an unprecedented pandemic. So there at one time or another might be the accusation that we were over planning had we not been faced with a situation such as this. My question, though, is are there any preliminary learnings that we've had both from public health and public safety that will allow us to course correct as we go through? And then following that, how often do both of those groups and other groups get together and have an integrated approach to an emergency situation? An example is municipalities locally every year are mandated to undertake a mock emergency. And are those types of exercises taken across departments, across provinces? And then the third question, so I'll let you deal with all of them, is when is there a plan to do post-implementation evaluation? When is there a plan to do a post-crisis and after-action review? I'm more concerned about what are we doing for the next time rather than pointing fingers at what wasn't done. So I'll start with public health.
So thank you very much for those questions. Ongoing learnings, we are taking note. We're doing sort of some interim course corrections as we go, and you can actually see that. But particularly, we're still learning about the virus as well. So our course corrections aren't necessarily with regards to our initial response, but as we learn more and more about the virus. So for example, more recently, moving our focus not just from symptomatic, but including asymptomatic, as we learned that people who are asymptomatic could transmit But there is, as a matter of course, a need for that ongoing learning and course correction. We do participate regularly with both provinces and territories and government federal departments in terms of table talk exercises and more serious real life type exercises. There's a whole range of things that we do in terms of the preparation and the actual emergency event planning and preparedness. And evaluations will be a huge part of this, and they will definitely inform where we're going in the future.
Okay, Public Safety Group.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. To add to what my colleague mentioned, the Government Operations Center is actually has started since day one to involve our team looking at producing an after-action report. So we have, for instance, to be practical, some members of the team that will be there to take some notes and to prepare that report once the time is right. In terms of learning and how to do things differently, I believe myself, when I reflect on it, I think I would have had a stronger surge capacity plans for my organizations to mobilize quickly and faster. And I would say that you mentioned about the point on exercising. We have a team in the Government Operations Center, and we work with other organizations like the public health agencies to be conducting some tabletop exercises, and including pandemic. We had one that was involving. It was about 6 months ago that was involving US and UK colleagues and the chief science advisor. So we really try, but it's a very small team on the tabletop exercise because we have a national exercise plans and we could do more on that front.
Okay, thank you. I know that we'd raised earlier concerns with respect to the Union of Canadian Correction Officers regarding the mental health, and I'm wondering if I could hear from the Canadian Police Association as well. Do you share the perspective that we've heard, and what are the recommendations to deal with mental health and to help deal with the strains of these types of crisis moments?
Yeah, that's a significant concern for our members. I think for police officers that are working in larger urban centers, they have access to more resources, they work for services with more capacity. However, it becomes a much bigger challenge for police officers that are working in police personnel that are working in more rural and remote environments. We are doing some things through the Canadian Institute of Public Safety Research and Treatment, which has been supported by the government in the past and all parties, to try and provide access to appropriate services online so that people working in rural remote areas can have access. We're delivering regular internet-based town halls and webinars so that members that need assistance can access that way. But it is a significant concern, and it is a priority for our organization.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen.
Okay, thank you.
Nous allons maintenant à Monsieur Champoux.
We'll now go to Mr. Champoux. You have 2.5 minutes. Mr. Champoux, please go ahead. You have the floor. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to say that my internet connection is quite unstable at present. So if you have trouble hearing me, that's the reason why. I'd like to come back to the release of some low-risk offenders in order to free up some space in the institutions. Now, we know that in some countries we've seen rioting, we've seen overflows, so we want to avoid that kind of situation. So my question for Mr. Wilkins, Mr. Thibault, and Mr. Stamatakis is, if there were to be an outbreak in some detention facilities, like in Joliette, a major one, a major COVID outbreak, and we needed to confine or do something, the release is not a solution for you. Well, what other options are there? What would you consider? What would you use? Barracks, army barracks, hotels? Do you have a plan B? I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Contingency plans, and quite often those aren't shared with the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers from the Correctional Service. And we raised the same questions. I said in my opening statements, what if? We have all of these questions, but I can tell you that we've had a significant outbreak of COVID in Mission Institution. We have a significant outbreak in Joliet Institution, and of course the very sick individuals. They quite often might be transported outside hospital under escort from correctional officers. And, we're trying to work around in BC, around Mission Institution in particular, a special unit that's outside of the hospital that's only for correctional officers and the inmates that they're escorting. And there's a lot of issues around that. So really what has been done is a reactive approach. When we get a big case, a big outbreak, we're reacting to that situation, not so much a proactive approach in the contingency processes of it, because we don't have the answers to some of these questions, to be honest. I know that there has been, in the Kingston corridor, there has been some communication from the military there that they'd be willing to open up barracks for any overflow, and I'm sure those conversations all happen behind the scenes, but we're not really included in them, to be quite honest.
Merci, Monsieur Champeau.
Merci.
We go now to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies, bring us home. Thank you.
Thank you. To the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers. Mr. Wilkins, 10 days ago, you were quoted in the media as saying, "We don't understand why management at Mission Institution are putting money before us. It is completely unacceptable that our members who were exposed to the coronavirus are being pressured to return to work prior to receiving their test results or finishing their 14 days isolation," end quote. Is that pressure still going on, and how widespread is it across the country?
Well, what we're seeing right now in some of the institutions is many correctional officers that have healed now and are coming back to the workplace. And I suggested in testimony before that the practice, I do believe, has stopped in bringing people back to work before their 14 days. The statement was made in essence of, when we look at what happened at Mission Institution, which has many different institutions in a very close proximity around that jail, and we look at what has happened in Port Cartier Institution that is very secluded, we didn't see the same reaction. So from our employer, and what should have happened at Mission Institution is they should have brought volunteers in from other institutions to come and work for a certain period of time that might include a quarantine to at the end of it. We didn't see that. So unfortunately, the pressure was on to try to save money. So let's call people back to work.
I see. If I can move to a different aspect, you've also called on the Correctional Service of Canada to educate the inmate population on all recommendations made by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Has CSC complied with that request?
Thank you for that question, and Mr. Chair. The problem that we're seeing, we're pretty well in lockdown for institutions that have cases of COVID, but other institutions or other, 40 institutions across the country, we're not completely locked down. Their inmates are still freely allowed to associate with one another in the courtyards for recreation purposes. We've managed to move most things to the unit level, and medication and food delivery either to the cell or to the unit itself. But we're not, in my community, if I go out and I hang out, I'm in Nova Scotia. If I have 5 or more people, I could be fined and for that. But yet you go to Spring Hill Institution that's in my community, and there's 23, 24, 50 inmates hanging out in the inside yard. So a little bit different, and that's kind of was the call, was that the CSC federally, we should respect that. But then again, we're dancing a fine line between unrest in the institution and the health and safety for all. So,
and Mr. Chair,
Mr. Davies, go ahead.
Thank you. Do I have a little bit of time?
No, your time is well up.
Thank you.
So that wraps up round 3. I would like to thank all the witnesses. It's been a great panel, and thank you for all of your experience and your expertise. And I would remind the members of the subcommittee of our meeting tomorrow morning. And with that, the meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.